Good evening. It's good to see everybody tonight. Welcome to Wednesday Night Bible Study. Welcome to folks online. We're glad you're with us. As we get started, just want to call attention just to a few things. First off, Pastor Bart's not with us tonight, but Jason Thomas is. And Jason, we're thankful to have you. And thinking about things coming up for the church, just a couple of things on my mind. Upward Soccer, of course, any chance you have to sign up for that, to coach, to lead, or just to come out and be supportive. It's about to get very serious around here. Second thing is our March 3rd. It's a Sunday. That'll be the first Sunday in March, well, March 3rd. But we're going to be having the Lord's Supper that Sunday morning. So just kind of want to mention that to you. Second thing on the schedule is we have a blood drive March 10th. And we have the men's fishing retreat March 19th through the 22nd. So just some little things kind of around the corner for us. As I kind of look over the prayer sheet, first off, I see Mr. Curtis Simmons. Mr. Curtis had a tough week last week. A lot of things kind of went crazy for him. And he's been in rehab at Cabrini. He's still there. I talked to his wife today. He is hoping to go home this Friday. They have not really found out what's going on with him, so there's that wish and just that desire to find out exactly what's going on with him. But he is walking on his own again, and he pretty much told a few folks he'd be back Sunday. So you got to love Mr. Curtis, who's always upstairs making coffee for 1 million people and comes super early, which I told his wife he's not allowed to walk the stairs or make any coffee this week, but I would love to see him if he comes back. Second on the list, Miss Joanne LaCour. She was supposed to have had surgery this past Friday. Different insurance issues came up. We need to pray that as the rescheduling happens, that everything falls into place so she can get the surgery that she needs. Dr. Jonathan Forster is on the list, and different things have happened with him. You know, he'd had the blood clot not long ago, but he's doing well from that. But he had a fall yesterday or this past evening, and I haven't had a chance to connect with him, but we want to be praying for him with that. And Lindsay Vickery is home. And doing things, but of course she was in the hospital last week, just dealing with a lot of different things as well, and we just want to continue to lift up Lindsay during this time. On the back page, I want to call attention for out-of-town list. We've got Ashley. This is Ashley Ray is her name, Miss Beth Cockrum's granddaughter. She's having surgery March 7th. She's already on your original prayer list. But we do know now that March 7th is the surgery, and it's a very serious surgery. And they ask us to be praying for that. Miss Gloria Simmons also asked today when she was calling, or when we were getting to talk and visit about her husband, Mr. Curtis, she brought up her son-in-law is having, once again, very serious eye surgery tomorrow. It's going to be the kind of surgery where he's got to lay flat for weeks and weeks after that surgery, dealing with some scar tissue pulling away his retina. So please be praying for Brian with that. Are there others that we can add to the list tonight? Well, all right. Well, I'm glad y'all are here. Let's go ahead and open up in prayer. I'll turn it over to Jason. Our sweet Heavenly Father, God, we love you. We praise you, God. God, I ask you just to be with our sweet church family and their families, Lord. God, just with all the different sicknesses going on, the flus and COVID and this and that, God, and just protect everybody through it and help them to get healthy and get back. Lord, I ask you just to be with Jason, Lord, as he comes up in just a minute to lead us tonight. Just speak through him, Lord. Continue to bless him with his teaching and speaking from the word, Lord. God, I just lift Mr. Curtis up to you. I continue to ask you just to heal him. Restore him, Lord, but please give them some answers so that he can keep what's going on from happening again. And for Miss Joanne, Lord, just open doors for her surgery time, and be with Dr. Jonathan through this fall, Lord, and with Lindsay, Lord, as she continues to heal at home. And God, I just ask you to Beth Cockrum's granddaughter, Lord. March 7th is a very big surgery for her sweet granddaughter, and we want everything to go well and wonderfully with that, Lord. And we ask you to be with Brian, Miss Gloria's son-in-law, God, that you would take him through that eye surgery and all would go well. Lord, for our sweet church family, God, there are things going on in everybody's lives. Even at this moment, Lord, things are happening that we can't necessarily mention, but Lord, it's on our hearts. And God, I ask you to be with those families that are hurting and to be in each of those situations. And God, we love you so much. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Jason, I'll leave this here in case, well, I'm going to set it right in case you need it.
Thank you, Brother Richard. Pow! That's all right, buddy. It's all right. Well, good evening, everybody. Since Richard turned on the camera, you didn't hear what he said before that, which was that I was nice enough to come and fill in. Look, you guys are nice enough to still be here. When you figured out I was teaching and you didn't run for the doors. So hats off. Standing ovation from my part to you, truly. I wasn't supposed to be here tonight. Brother Jeff Richard was actually going to come and serenade you all with his teaching, but sadly he is part of the, at this point, nameless rabble of people who have been either sick with COVID or flu. His whole house, total of 5 of them in there, and I think only one has yet to actually test positive for the flu yet, so hoping and praying that little one doesn't, but both mom and dad are down, and of course several little ones, so you can imagine they need our prayers. But yeah, Brother Jeff was supposed to be here tonight, leading you all in the third of our major Moses-like Jesus teaching blocks through the book of Matthew. So just a quick reminder of why we're doing this. Partly because it's supposed to serve as an introduction, a segue into what you're already reading, because of course when we cycled past Sunday, got into Monday, we were all flipping to Chuck's handbook and figuring out what are our reading assignments. We've already read through this particular passage. We're a few days into not only his workbook, but actually the assigned readings from his text, which actually, maybe you have realized this, are a little larger than they've been. I mean, we were kind of getting spoiled on days of just 1 or 2 pages, and last couple of days has been closer to almost 10 pages apiece. But I guess that's good. Maybe that gives you a little bit of preparedness for tonight if you're up to snuff on those reading assignments. And of course, to also help you kind of understand by giving you some guidelines when you guys enter back into your small groups come this Sunday as to how to appreciate what this text is really driving at over the course of the remainder of this week's studies and whatnot, and then hopefully throw out some fodder for you guys to talk about on Sunday as you're chewing over those questions in the workbook. And then with my group, after we spend about 20-ish minutes or so doing that, we got about an hour of time to either just look at each other's sappy faces or try to nerd out on the Bible. So we try to opt for the other because the first one's not so fun. And as you talk about it, maybe you can do one of 2 things. Hey, that was an interesting insight that Jason brought up. Or that guy's a heretic and nobody should ever let him teach again. Either way, we're going to get there. So I know we're in chapter 13 tonight, but before we get to chapter 13, which begins for us the parables discourse, I want to help us better understand one key principle with respect to not only just reading Matthew's gospel, all the gospels, every book of the Bible. It's a challenge, I know, and a daunting task, especially in the busy lives that we live, for us to try to read the Bible in such a way that we can take a book like Matthew and its 28 chapters and read it as quickly as possible. Now, at a slow enough pace that you're not just simply speed flicking through every one of these verses and barely picking up more than just a few words, but at the same time not so arduously slow that you're failing to keep track of what was it that I read 2 weeks ago when I started Matthew's gospel, because a lot of our reading plans have a tendency to put us on that path, and that's not necessarily bad, but at the same time it's hard for us to keep these things at the forefront of our mind, because Matthew has been laying down a lot of themes in the opening portion of his gospel without being so gracious as, say, a Luke or maybe even a John, who will parenthetically tell us, hey, I really want you to pay attention to what I just said, and I'm going to even tell you what it means so you don't miss out on it. Matthew just assumes that a big Jewish audience of people taking this gospel are going to be able to pick up on these nice morsels of bread that he's aligning like a nice trail to arrive at the end point and just seeing this beautiful microcosmic spectacle of the whole Bible jammed into Matthew's gospel. And that's right, what I just said, the whole Bible jammed into Matthew's gospel. Because on the one hand, we've got this surface overlay of Jesus erupting like a new Moses figure. And even toward the end of the gospel, he's like a new Joshua. But embedded underneath all of that, we're seeing the whole diorama of Israel's history being replayed all over again. And if we're not capturing that, then there are layers built into Matthew's gospel that we are totally missing, which of course is going to reflect and have a great deal to do with how we interpret these passages. That's part of the reason why communal reading is so important, why teachers and pastors being in the offices that they are within the church are so important, to try to take all that nerdy information, that year's worth of seminary, and just combing through commentary upon commentary, and just then still scratching the surface to try to pour into our brains to help us better learn, right? So anyway, enough gilding the lily. We got to back up to chapter 12 because we're in a transition, a liminal space between the last discourse and this one. How has Matthew's gospel evolved from then to now? Matthew chapter 12, let's just read a few verses here. I'm actually going to start in verse 3. He said to them, "Haven't you read what David did when those who were with him were hungry?" Not going to embellish upon this. We've already talked about this. If Matthew started the gospel off by giving us a synopsis that's so close in structure to what we saw with Moses, right? Here we have a promised deliverer who is going to come on the scene, a genealogy that bears this out, the promised son of David and Abraham, and a long list of names. And then we have a Joseph who has dreams, just like the Joseph in ancient Egypt who had dreams, and starts that whole exile in Egypt, Exodus out of Egypt story arc. And that stepfather of Jesus is the one who is caring for and protecting this Christ child who is born in the place he's supposed to be, but very quickly, while people are coming to see him and make Herod aware this child is going to be imminently born, Herod now wants to be like Pharaoh and go snuff this child out, right? And he can't kill him because the child escapes beforehand. He has an exile imposed upon him, just like Moses did whenever he killed the Egyptian taskmaster and then fled off to the land of Midian for safe refuge. Jesus is not even safe in his own homeland. Instead, he has to go to the place where Israel used to be captive to find refuge. Now, with that, we continue this whole story arc because Moses leads the people of Egypt out into the wilderness. 40 what in the wilderness? 40 years. Jesus comes out of the wilderness preaching the gospel. Jesus comes out of this birth narrative sequence now back into the land. He's a full-grown man, and he is baptized in the river Jordan, which is where Israel's exodus ended when they crossed through the river to get into Canaan. And after that, he's driven into the Spirit for 40 days, mimicking all of that with respect to Israel's walk in the wilderness. Now he, as the new Israel, out in the wilderness. Then, just like Joshua brought them into the land, he comes through the Jordan River, coming into the land, telling everybody the kingdom of heaven is at hand, walks right up to the summit of a mountain in chapter 5, where Rodney gave us our first discourse, and then he's preaching his kingdom manifesto. But as we've transitioned from there through his sending out of his disciples now into this discourse, starting with chapter 12, we're seeing a shift of focus, and it's ever so subtle, but we've got to pick up on it. Because all throughout this chapter, we have littered references to David and his kingdom and the Sabbath. And the Sabbath might not seem like it's that important to you, but you need to anchor this back to where it came from in the Old Testament. Can anybody tell me where's the first reference of the Sabbath in Scripture? Creation, right there. We crown off Creation Week with the Sabbath. Now, on the front side of the Sabbath, before we get there, we've got God making a man, and then he tells him to rule and subdue. And what kind of language is rule and subdue? Well, in order to rule, you have to be a what? A king. Man, you guys are all over it. That's awesome. A king, absolutely. So man is coronated king, and then he's invited into this Sabbath rest with God. But then we get this different creation picture in chapter 2 where he's made outside the garden, and God has made a sacred space for this king to come and share God's rule and authority with him as he enjoys Sabbath rest, whatever that means. It can't be a coincidence then that this particular chapter starts off with a reference to David by Jesus and the fact that he is the Son of Man figure who is receiving this kingdom promised to that Son of Man figure in Daniel 7. But it's a kingdom far greater than David's. It's a kingdom that's going to know no ends as goes its glory, and it will never pass away to another. So it's a kingdom that's going to fill not just the earth, but even the cosmos. Because by the end of this gospel, it's going to be Jesus saying, all authority in heaven and earth are mine. And this kingdom is going to bring with it Sabbath rest. Now, if you're asking, what does this have to do with the parables? Well, number one, I've just mentioned kingdom, right? If you've read through the text of Matthew 13, as we were supposed to do at the beginning of this week, you know that the context of Matthew 13 is almost exclusively about what? The kingdom, because they're kingdom parables. So it has everything to do with feeding into that. Now, I'm just going to very briefly summarize the rest of this chapter, because then Jesus heals a man on the Sabbath with a shriveled hand, and guess who doesn't like what he did? Anybody want to take a guess? The Pharisees. Then they claim he's the one casting out demons and doing all this stuff because he's actually in league with Satan. And then, of course, Jesus talks about the crashing in of the kingdom of heaven that's going to do battle and is doing battle right now with the kingdom that's already in existence. He couches that in the terms of there's a strong man who rules. But if he could just have known when the thief was going to come, he would have prepared himself, but he had no idea. The thief is here. The thief is binding the strong man, and the thief is going to be spoiling everything that belongs to that strong man. This is also the concept of the kingdom of heaven, and even so in Matthew 16, his church prevailing even against the very gates of hell, which cannot withstand it. And again, Jesus continues to call himself very openly the Son of Man. Then Jesus goes on to talk about, starting with verse 33, how you'll know a tree by the fruit it produces. He's calling out the Pharisees and saying in very clear terms through these analogies he is painting for them that they are the bad trees, and those who are following him, Jesus, as disciples, are indeed the good trees. Then we get to 38, the sign of Jonah. They want to see a sign, and Jesus says the only sign you get is the sign of Jonah. He was 3 days, 3 nights in the belly of the great fish. The Son of Man, the one who receives this cosmic kingdom, will also be 3 nights and 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth. All that to say, that's how this kingdom is truly going to come into existence. And it will be the one sign at the end of this story by which they will know, listen to me now, when Jesus was standing in front of Caiaphas and he tells him, when he puts him under oath, tell me now, are you the Son of God? And he says, I am. And indeed, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, like Daniel 7 said, coming on the clouds of heaven, meaning being installed at the right hand of God, receiving this cosmic rule and the authority over all the nations, which is how Jesus concludes Matthew's gospel. What does that mean? That after they experience the resurrection and the rumor the disciples are spreading that he's alive again, they've got to face it down. Is he indeed alive? They can't find a body. What does this mean? Well, then the book of Acts comes along, and all the signs that are portrayed through that and the work of the disciples continue to demonstrate again and again. Jesus reigns. The authority of his kingdom is consummate now. It's taking over even the kingdoms of the world, and nothing that any man can do will stand in its way. True relationships. This is how this gospel, or this chapter ends right here. I'm sorry, I actually bypassed this passage, and it's quite important. Verse 43. Jesus gives us this little enigmatic thing with respect to talking about how when one spirit goes out, it can find 7 other spirits and come back to the place it once inhabited, and it's worse over again. What does that mean? I would just briefly summarize this now to tie it into what we're going to be talking about in chapter 13 to say that Jesus is referencing Israel. I mean, after all, you have to stop and think about it. Scratch your head. Throughout the Old Testament, as we've watched Israel, evil as they were at moments, we don't really hear any reference to outright demonic activity, do we? Can anybody think of a passage in anywhere between Genesis and Malachi where you see demons front and center? Not there, right? So why is it when we move into Matthew, demons are everywhere? And better yet, where does Jesus encounter demons? Outside of him being in the area of Gennesaret, where he meets the Gadarene demoniacs, overcome by the legion of demons that inhabits those 2 men, all the rest of this demonic activity is squarely in the land of ancient Israel. How did Israel become so overrun with demons? This is a judgment upon them. The spiritual rot and decrepidation from the return of them from Babylon back to the land until the arrival of Messiah demonstrates that, number one, they need this exodus that Messiah is about to lead them on, and number 2, they are ripe with evil. And Jesus is talking about this in this very statement with respect to demons being cast out and yet returning again to make the land worse than before, right? And that's exactly where they are. All that to say, when we get to the end of this chapter and Jesus speaks the question, who is my mother or my brother or my sisters? Look at these who follow me. These are my family. And this is an indictment against them. He means that it has nothing to do with blood kinship. It has everything to do with the fact that those who are following after him as his disciples are those who are in the family, those who will sit down at the feast. Jesus has already made the statement. It will be a scandalous thing when the day comes and those who think themselves sons of the kingdom will find themselves from the outside looking in, while those from the east and the west, i.e. the Gentiles, will come in droves and sit down beside Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and enjoy the sumptuous feast. To sum up this chapter, we are moving away from the period of Israel's story where they are out in the wilderness after being exodusized, I just made that word up, from Egypt to go into the wilderness, waiting to go into Canaan. And now we are going into this part of the story where David is front and center, and Jesus is being pictured as a new David. And that shouldn't be a surprise to us. Why? Well, when we open up Matthew chapter 1, what do we find in the opening verses? This is the genealogy, the record of Jesus' lineage, the son of David. So now we are getting to that point where Matthew is wanting to make sure what is front and center information for us is the fact that Jesus, as we've already seen him being a new and greater Moses, is a new and greater David. Now, if you wonder why that's important, because Matthew is about to jump into a whole slew of chapters where he is going to take the history of Israel's monarchy from David as their greatest and iconic king to the end where they are destroyed as a kingdom, i.e. Judah and Babylon, and then sent off into exile. And in this, he is going to give us a microcosm. I like using that word. I think it's like the 5th time I've used it tonight. A microcosm, if you will, of Israel's history in the monarchy united under David. And very quickly in the next chapter, we are going to look at the transition over to Solomon and then the divided monarchy right after Solomon dies and the kingdom splits into Israel and Judah. And you might wonder again why that matters. Because Matthew is marching out this history to show us one clear thing. Jesus is the true Israel. Everybody else that just claims ethnic ties to Israel through Jacob, descended from Abraham, has one clear choice to make. Either embrace Jesus as Messiah and follow him, or else they're going to be left on the outside while they watch the Gentiles come in and enjoy this kingdom. Any questions on that before I move forward? Please ask. I don't want to keep moving forward if you're like, I'm kind of stuck there. I don't know what you meant by that. Because otherwise, some of the rest of this stuff's not going to make a lot of sense. Anything? We're good? Okay. So here we are. Matthew 13. We can slow down a little bit now because we don't have so much that we have to sum up to make sure we understand what we're about to get into. All right, so we start off here with the parable of the sower. Now, granted, this is the one unique parable to this particular chapter that doesn't start off with, what can the kingdom of heaven be compared to? While everyone that follows it will be. Now, rather than sit here and try to exegetically talk about what each of these parables mean, because in the next hour we don't have enough time to do it justice, again, our venture to start off with was to just simply throw out some guidelines, some points to ponder, some fodder for you guys to first think on, chew over, and then maybe talk about when you all meet up come Sunday. So Jesus tells the parable, 4 soils. 3 of them are extremely unsuccessful for various reasons. One is over and abundantly successful. If you've read what Chuck has had to say so far, he's kind of sensationalized this by talking about how even the 30, 60, 100-fold is really in increments of 100s above that. So it's not the usual yield, and it's something that would have been surprising to these particular hearers. And he's also made sure we are keenly aware of the fact this passage is not really talking about evangelism, albeit I'm sure in our own traditions, wherever we have grown up and spent time at growing up in Southern Baptist church life, we've probably heard our fair share of sermons and lessons taught using this particular passage as a means of speaking and charging us with the idea of go and share, because the seed is the word, and when we do, it will produce fruit. But Chuck has, in that scholarly way, so astutely made sure we're aware of the fact it's not talking about evangelism for the sake of souls being converted to the faith. It's talking about the good works as fruit that comes by virtue of that. And I want to make mention of that for the reason that will become clear over the course of our next hour together as goes what I think this parable is ultimately driving at, all right? But I'm actually going to shelve this parable for a second, and I'm going to come back to it at the end. Instead, I'm first going to go into Jesus' explanation of it because of the fact his disciples ask him a very key question. In verse 10, the disciples came up to him, "Why are you speaking to them in parables?" And this would subsume the idea that Jesus hasn't been doing that with them. And of course, if you've watched The Chosen, or a show or a movie like that, you can imagine the disciples being super gemmed up about the idea of, you've talked to us, we get it, or at least we think we get it. And by virtue of that, we know that when everybody else hears what you have to say to us, they'll get it too. But then when Jesus goes out there and hits the streets with this kind of message, it's like, what are you talking about, right? It's like hearing that visiting preacher come in who preached a sermon when we're all walking away from that being like, you know, I think I had him at one point, but no, who am I kidding? He didn't have me anywhere tracking him. I don't know what he was talking about. Maybe you've ever had that experience. Maybe you're going to be like that when you walk out of here tonight. I don't know. But either way, point being is that when he speaks to them in parables, it's perplexing to his own disciples. So they ask this question, and Matthew wants to make sure, for posterity's sake, as we're tracking with Matthew's agenda, seeing Jesus as Moses, because this continues that idea, but now also seeing him as a new David. Why is this important? We're not taking this concept in a modular sense. We don't just leave behind everything from Matthew 1 through 12, and then now we're in a new discourse, and we act as though that didn't happen, and this is speaking something else entirely different. It's all connected, so we need to understand how it's all connected. So Jesus will start in verse 11 by saying, "Because the secrets of the kingdom of heaven have been given for you to know," hinting at the idea this parable speaks to that concept, even though it doesn't start with what can the kingdom of heaven be likened unto or compared to. It's given for you to know, but it was not given to them, right? Why is that? Well, instead of reading the rest of this, let's get to verse 14. Isaiah's prophecy is fulfilled in them, which says, "You will listen and listen, but never understand. You will look and look, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown callous, their ears are hard of hearing, and they have shut their eyes, otherwise they might see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts, and turn back, and I would heal them." Now here's where we oftentimes as readers just stop and think, that's an interesting application from where that comes from in the Old Testament. And then, of course, there might be a footnote, as there is in my Bible, which doesn't want to work when I click on it. But you can see it, the little superscript B there. You probably have one in your big 6-inch thick study Bible that tells you this comes from Isaiah chapter what? Anybody want to follow that reference? Where does it come from? Isaiah 6. Let's all turn back to Isaiah 6, shall we? Familiar passage to most of us. We're pretty much aware of Isaiah's temple vision in the year that King Uzziah died, but that's just it. Uzziah was the first king that Isaiah rules under, and it only gets worse from here. But here's what we have. After God calls Isaiah, touches his lips with the coal of fire from the altar of incense, telling him his sins are atoned, and now he is going to send him. And then, what we have in verse 9, when Isaiah says, "Here I am, send me," then he replied, "Go, say to these people, keep listening, but do not understand. Keep looking, but do not perceive. Make the minds of these people dull." Okay, so Matthew is not proof texting. One thing that has to be abundantly clear for all of you is Matthew is not just simply saying, this is what Isaiah was talking about. Because number one, that would mean what God is saying to Isaiah is not relevant to his own contextual generation. Isaiah is going to spend the rest of his time under the reign of the next 4 kings doing this very thing, preaching, and yet they won't hear. Their ears will grow calloused and dull, and until eventually, he says, how long do I do this? Until cities lie in ruins without inhabitants. Okay, so what territory is going to be devastated like this? Is it going to be the nations that lie in ruins and cities without inhabitants, or is it going to be fill in the blank. Israel. It's going to be Israel. How do we know this? Great question. Go back to chapter 1. Chapter 1, verse 1. The vision concerning Judah and Israel that Isaiah, son of Amoz, saw during the reigns. These visions concern Judah and Jerusalem. He is a prophet to that kingdom first and foremost. And this happens to be during the time when Israel is in a divided state, as goes their kingdom, right? From the days of Solomon when he died and his son Rehoboam was supposed to ascend to the throne of a still united kingdom, the kingdom is broken into because of Solomon's apostasy, and we could continue on down that rabbit hole. But they remain fractured until eventually under Hoshea, the last king of Israel, the Assyrians come and take them into captivity. And a little more than a century later comes Nebuchadnezzar with Babylon, and after 3 sieges, they are destroyed and carried off to captivity. What does this have to do with what I'm speaking about all the way over here in Matthew? Great question. Let's go back to Matthew 13 and we'll see. Matthew 12, now we're seeing references to Jesus as a new David. You just heard me talk a minute ago about how as this tracks forward, we're now going to see a flash from David into Solomon. So we're going to take a brief stop here for a second. Parables. Can you think of anybody else aside from Isaiah? I'm taking that easy answer away from you. Who else in the Bible is noted for speaking many, many parables? Come on, I know somebody's got it. Don't be afraid to say it. I'm going to assume somebody said Solomon. Solomon, yeah, right? We're told in Scripture this man spoke over 3,000 parables. And Solomon is noted to be the most wisest man who ever lived other than Jesus. And Solomon happens to be the son of David, the very next descendant right after David. Not a son of David 10 generations removed. He is the son who sits upon David's throne as God had promised he indeed would in setting up this house for David. Can you see where we're going with this? So not only is Jesus a new and greater David, now in speaking this plethora of parables, because Matthew is the only gospel writer who sandwiches as many of these parables together as he does. The closest would be Luke, but Luke spreads them out. He chops them up into different chapters. Why does Matthew feel the need to jam them all together? The sequence: Moses, David, Solomon. Are we tracking? Okay. And again, after the days of Solomon comes his son Rehoboam, and what happens in Rehoboam's day? The kingdom becomes divided. Isaiah is called to be a prophet, and he's a prophet to the southern kingdom of Judah, meaning he's a prophet during the time of Israel's what? Divided monarchy, kingdom, exactly. And what these words are in Isaiah 6 are clearly words of judgment. God is going to send Isaiah as a prophet to the people. Will these people rejoice at the words that Isaiah has to say? Any thoughts? Of course not. They're going to hear, but not truly listen. What is said is going to happen to their ears. They're going to grow what? Dim, calloused, dull. They're going to look, but truly not see and understand. And by virtue of all of this, they are going to have judgment reaped upon them, because the rest of Isaiah's scroll is all bent toward the fact that that exile is coming. And when that exile comes, you yourselves are going to feel that devastation in ways you never thought you would. Remember, it's very similar to what Jeremiah has to say when they are all crying, but the temple, God is not going to, yes, He is going to treat this place just like Shiloh and allowed it to be destroyed. So let me sum up here by saying, while we're looking at this particular parable, and we might be thinking Jesus is talking about our commission to go to the nations and preach the gospel. On the one hand, we might need to rethink that for the words that Chuck has given and the same reason I have. And second to that, what does this mean in the context of the entire story of Matthew's gospel? Israel is ripe for judgment. And the rest of these parables is going to demonstrate that. After all, we're about to get into this parable here in a second that's going to be talking about wheat and tares, if you use the King James language, or perhaps better understood to us is wheat and weeds. Who are the wheat and the weeds, right? Jesus will tell us, but we still have to consider what's going on in Jesus' own day and what this means in the here and now then rather than the here and now for us in this particular time. All right? So then he goes on to explain the parable of the sower to them, but like I said, we're going to shelve that for a minute, and we're going to instead jump into verse 24, where we get into the parable of the wheat and the weeds. Before I do that, though, I want to give you something to consider. Let's go back to the end of Matthew chapter 9 and read a passage. Matthew 9, and you'll pick up with me in verse 37. Then he said to the disciples, "The harvest is abundant, but the workers are few. Therefore, pray to the Lord of the harvest to send workers out into the harvest." So Jesus is pointing out there's a harvest that's ready now. Correct? Maybe I understand that wrong. Can anybody else look at that verse and tell me whether or not you think Jesus means a harvest that's pending in the future or a harvest that's ready and available for them to start working in now in their own day? It seems readily apparent from the context, the harvest is ready now. Okay, so then when we fast forward over to Matthew 13 and we get to listen to Jesus talking about harvesting here, the question has to be, which harvest are we talking about? Now let me just try to simplify this real quick and not keep you guessing. I believe that these parables have a contextual application for those who are hearing him say these words as they're literally escaping his lips. To take into consideration what's been going on, what activity God has been manifesting amongst his people for the last 5 centuries since they have been restored and they've built their temple and city again and they've just been waiting for Messiah and the arrival of God's kingdom and his anointed king to rule over them. And it also has application for the rest of church history, however long that's going to stretch out until Christ comes to rule physically amongst us. But the question is, as far as fulfillment goes, when did that happen? I don't want to be dogmatic in telling you. Instead, I would just rather lead you along the way and let you come to what conclusions you do. Hence your conversations you'll have later on internally and corporately with your people. So when Jesus begins in verse 24, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed seed in his field. But while people were sleeping, his enemy came, sowed weeds amongst the wheat, and left. When the plant sprouted and produced grain, then the weeds also appeared. The landowner's servants came to him and said, "Master, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he told him. "So do you want us to go and pull them up?" the servants asked him. "No," he said. "When you pull up the weeds, you might also uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At harvest time, I'll tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and tie them in bundles to burn them, but collect the wheat in my barn." So then we get down later to an explanation of what this means, beginning in verse 36, when his disciples say, "Please explain this to us." And he said, okay, so the one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. Again, a kingly reference. The field is the world, and the good seed, these are the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is at the end of the age. Let's park it right here for a second. The end of the age. There's a reason why more modern translations make sure we understand this is the use of the word genea rather than the actual word that would be used in Greek to translate world. Spherical globe turning on its axis, because these are two different things. This is not the end of the cosmos. We have to make sure we understand end of the age. But the question still remains, when does the end of the age come? Because the one thing that will probably loom large in our mind from the traditions that we've been handed down to us would be, this is an eschatological judgment that's being talked about here. I'm not going to try to tell you it's not. Instead, I'm asking you to just stop for a second and be willing to rework the Rubik's Cube of your mind and consider the possibility maybe it isn't. When is the end of the age? Because this is the very same thing that Jesus is going to say when he starts the last and final discourse in Matthew 24. It really starts in 23, but it's often subtitled at the beginning of 24, the Olivet Discourse. And I can tell you, if you've skipped ahead in Chuck's readings, Chuck is definitely one of those who exists on the spectrum of partial preterism. Now, that's a very big spectrum there to slide your indicator on as to where you fall in that, meaning that either you believe all of the contents of Matthew 24 actually occurred in 1st century AD with the fall of Jerusalem, or parts of it did, and parts are still reserved for a yet still future eschatological judgment. I guess we'll get into that in the future. Not our discourse for tonight. But it still ties into this. It still ties into this. Because there are scads of commentators out there who suggest or point very strongly to the idea that what Jesus is talking about in Matthew 24 in total surrounds the siege of Jerusalem in AD 66 that ends in AD 70. That was the end of the Old Covenant age and the arrival of the new. Now you might say, I hope you're not feeling your blood pressure starting to rise and your neck and face starting to turn red thinking, that guy's spouting heresy. Just go with me for a second. Let's go back to the story of the prophets. For those prophets who were beginning to prophesy of the age of Messiah, what was their perspective? Was their perspective that Messiah would come and then there is an unanticipated portion of history that's going to stretch on indeterminately and then he is going to come back again and then when he comes again he will rule and reign for all eternity? Or was their perspective that all of time would become consummate at the moment when Messiah arrives and with him his divine kingdom? You tell me, which is it? When you read Isaiah, when you read Zechariah, Malachi, Micah, you name any of them, how do they paint the picture? Does time seem to end when Messiah arrives? Or does time briefly pause and then we go on for how long until he comes a second time? What do you see when you read those? The last one, that he comes at the end of the story. Okay, well, how does that factor into Matthew chapter 9? We just read a second ago, Jesus calls his disciples' attention to the fields that surround them. He's telling them now is the time for harvest. That would seem to suggest that maybe, just maybe, the age, the one they live in, is becoming consummate and is about to pass away. And a new age is going to come. That new age is going to start with the arrival of Messiah. Hey, he's here. The arrival of the kingdom. Hey, like John before him, he's preaching, it's now. It's now. We're not waiting on that. You can't reckon that truth from what either John or Jesus or any of the rest of the apostles are saying. When Jesus sends his disciples to go preach in the cities of Israel, what does he tell them to preach? The kingdom of heaven is here. When we in the book of Acts, and Paul is under house arrest in Rome, entertaining visitors who can come and go as they want to, what is he preaching to them? The kingdom of heaven. That it's arrived, not that they're waiting on it. Okay? So if that's the case, again, what do we make of end of the age? Let's hold out for the possibility that maybe what this is, as goes this harvest at the end of the age, is actually going to be a harvest that focuses on Israel, not just Israel and the nations. Or it could be Israel and the nations. Let's read further and see what we get. The harvest is at the end of the age, and the harvesters are at the angels. Now, the harvesters are the angels. I know what you're thinking. This is the moment where you were like, well, silly rabbit, tricks are for kids. If you had just simply read the final 5 words, you would have understood when this is going to happen because, well, I flipped through the pages of history and I don't remember a time when angels came from heaven to gather the harvest and bring them into the kingdom. Well, that would be true. But what we have to also understand is that this word in Greek, angelos, doesn't always refer simply to those winged creatures who exist in dimensions beyond our own and are sent to be God's divine messengers as flames of fire whenever he wants to execute their arrival. They're also humans. So if angels, angelos, can be humans, who is responsible for this harvest? I'm not trying to tell you what to think. I'm just simply trying to open up your mind for possible alternative explanations for you to decide and think and discuss amongst yourselves. If that's the case, if humans are the harvesters, then when would this harvest be? Maybe the harvest is at the end of the age when Jerusalem is destroyed, the temple along with it, And with that, Israel is released to go to the nations. What we have in AD 70 is a final ingathering of all those Jews who have come to Messiah and followed Jesus as their rightful Lord and King. And now they are being pointed out to the nations. They've already been going by this point, and they are going to continue to go and reap a harvest amongst the nations, which is where they have been sent to. So maybe that's one way we can look at this. So therefore, just as the weeds are gathered and burned in the fire, so will it be at the end of the age. Would that track with the destruction of Jerusalem? Yes. What happened when Titus broke through the actual barrier of the upper city and came to destroy first the temple, then Jerusalem? You think about it. How exactly did Jesus' prophecy of no one stone will be left upon another get fulfilled? The reason why, as Josephus tells us, is because when the temple was accidentally set on fire, the heat was so great, it caused all the gold trappings within the temple to start melting, and it was flowing through the streets of Jerusalem like rivers of gold. And it started to melt when it cooled in between the cracks of the rocks. So the Romans started to take whatever they could that was stiff enough to pry the rocks apart to get to the gold. That's why they pulled the temple down stone by stone. So if fire consumed the temple and Jerusalem, do you think human casualties got caught up in that? Well, you can guarantee they did. Absolutely. Not to mention, fire is often used just as a symbolic reference to the idea of great, vehement judgment. So there's another possibility. And the Son of Man will send out his angels. They will gather his kingdom, all who cause sin and those guilty of lawlessness. They will throw them into the blazing furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in their Father's kingdom. Let anyone who has ears listen. The righteous will shine like the sun goes back as a reference to Daniel chapter 12, where Daniel speaks of a great resurrection at the end of time, or perhaps the end of the age. At the end of the age, there will be those who arise. Those who are righteous shine like the sun. Those who are wicked off to eternal torment. Matthew's gospel is very unique to us because when he mentions the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, Matthew is the only one that ties into it something extra or something special that happened in Jerusalem and around Jerusalem at this time. Anybody have any idea what I'm talking about? When Jesus died, there were strangers roaming the streets of Jerusalem. Who were these people? They were resurrected patriarchs. Ever wonder why that details in Matthew's gospel? Why doesn't Mark say anything about that? Or Luke? John, well, he's kind of always out there on his own doing his own thing. But for those who share this synoptic tradition, why is Matthew the only one in this most Jewish-oriented gospel that wants to make sure we recognize that when Jesus died, that broke open tombs, and before he himself was raised from the dead, those who had died before him, in faith, waiting upon his arrival, were seen literally walking the streets of Jerusalem. The righteous rose to shine like the sun. Within a generation, as he promised in Matthew 23 and 24, rejected him and wanted Rome to crucify him, decrying that he's no king, Caesar's our king, we'll gladly accept his blood on our heads, are going to be those who are burned in fire, where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. I mean, there are points there that line up. You make of that what you will. I'm just throwing that out there. So with that, what do we do as it relates to the rest of these parables? And what do we make of it? Before we look at any other parables, let me try to sum this up a little bit and make some sense of it. Jesus seems to be suggesting the harvest is right now. All right, well, if that's the case, smart guy, when was the actual planting phase of this great harvest actually occurring? Well, that's a good question. When would we say it's occurring? Go back to the parable of the sower. All the way up here at the top, this is what we get to. Verse 3. Consider the sower who went out to sow. As he sowed, some seed fell among the path. So what's this seed sower doing? Is he digging apart nice little rows to drop the seed in and then cover it back for the seed to grow like any sensible farmer would? What does he seem to be doing? Just throwing it indiscriminately everywhere. Get the word picture in your mind. I'm going to try to actually draw this out a little while to make it somewhat awkwardly uncomfortable for us because I want you to get that picture in your mind. Just throwing the seed out there indiscriminately. Wherever it goes, it doesn't matter. He has no thought or care. He knows some of it will produce. He knows a lot of it won't. It's not lost on him. He's throwing it on the gravel. It's not lost on him. That's a briar patch, and he's throwing some over there too. His friends and neighbors may be asking him while he's out there just mindlessly broadcasting, dude, what are you doing? You can clear those rocks out of the way, and it will guarantee a higher yield, and yet he's just throwing. He's even letting the wind carry some of this wherever it may go. Some of that might even get spread over to somebody else's property where he can't even claim that harvest. Can you think of a time in Israel's story when they were seemingly flung like this, indiscriminately, away by a seed sower? Just think. Let's run through those stories. So we're in Egypt, then there's Moses. We come out of Egypt, we're in the wilderness. We don't want to go into Canaan. There's a new generation. We go into Canaan. We're bad. There are judges. We get punished. We do good. We get punished. There's eventually a prophet, and he crowns a king. We get better. Then we kind of slide back. Then we break apart, and we act like we don't like each other. They continue to get sour. We have our good moments and our bad moments. They continue to fall off the cliff until God just decides, I've had enough, and it's time to exact the curses of the covenant. Deuteronomy 28, Leviticus 26. And he sends Shalmaneser in there. And what does Shalmaneser do, the king of Assyria, to the northern kingdom of Israel? After he destroys their capital city, Samaria, those who are alive, he does what with them? He deports them. Think about that. Here they are in their kingdom of Israel. They get picked up and done what with? They get flung to the nations. Go read the text yourself. There it is in 2 Kings 18. They are indiscriminately sown to any place where the king wants to send them. We even have some of the cities and regions that they were sent to. They don't all go into one location and just hold up there waiting for something to happen to bring them back to their land. As far as we know, they're lost to history. We hear nothing about them again. And we know that they go moving all over creation after that, because come the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, we've got Jews coming from Spain and Media all the way outside of Rome's territory. How did they get there, and why are they there? Who are these Jews? Are they part of those lost 10 tribes? We don't know. Then about a century or so later, we have Judah kind of doing the same thing, right? The words of Ezekiel, you would have thought that you would have learned from your perverted prostitute sister Israel what not to do, but instead you acted twice the whore that she did, so guess what I'm about to do to you? Then he sends Nebuchadnezzar 3 times. And with that, what does he do? Scoops them up, and after he kills all he wants and satiates his bloodlust, what does he do to the rest of the inhabitants of the kingdom of Judah? He scatters them. Now you might be asking, well, what does this have to do with anything? Okay, great question. What is not shown us in Scripture, and that we have to dig into those annals that often form what's called the Apocrypha, the books that exist between the Testaments that are not scriptural but are great history material, and those other Second Temple literary books that come to us from the times before Jesus showed up by a few centuries up until the time Jesus arrives. We get a good history lesson. And what are those history lessons? The characters that we are introduced to in the New Testament that weren't there in the Old, we're told how they come about. Pharisees, who are these people? Sadducees, again. Synagogues, what is that? Moses said nothing about synagogues, so who in the world said this would be a good idea and made it a norm? So much so that Jerusalem has more than 24 synagogues, it's estimated as such, in the day of Jesus. This all comes to us as traditions that Matthew and Jesus are referring to in the 5 centuries from the time of the days of Ezra, Jeshua, Zechariah, and all of those people that were part of the first wave of migrants that came back to resettle the land up until the time of Jesus. And those synagogues are scattered everywhere. How do we know those synagogues are scattered everywhere? I don't want to answer. I want you to answer. How do we know there's synagogues outside of the land of Israel at this time? Where do they go to first? If you can find the synagogue, there's the menorah, you know what you're looking for. These are the people that are ripe. And what exactly is the thing that happens when Paul, Barnabas, any of these dudes wind up walking into a synagogue? They lay it down. Here it is. Messiah has come. Let's roll out the scrolls. Let's read through it. I'm going to show you how this was fulfilled in Jesus, the Nazarene, but carpenter, Bethlehem born, son of David. And what is the reaction that Paul often winds up getting from this crowd of Jews who hears? You have some who will believe and some who will. And what would we classify them as? Those who believe, we would say in the terms of this parable here, are wheat. And those who don't believe are weeds. And do you think that there's some separation going on here? Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. After all, Paul's the one telling them, this was for you. And if you judge yourselves unworthy to hear it, that's fine. We'll go to the Gentiles. Now, for those Jews who did believe the messenger of these apostles, do you think that they were continually invited to come to this synagogue and learn Sabbath after Sabbath with those who wanted to kill Paul? Probably not. So who do you think they started meeting with? Probably those Gentiles. Do you think that at that moment there was a separation between the wheat and the weeds? It seems like that. It seems like that. So if that's the case, when was the end of the age? All of that is tracking up toward the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, when Jesus is going to send his harvesters, i.e. possibly humans in the form of, well, let me rephrase that, under the guise of the word angels, who are his ministers, his messengers. It just seems like it might be trending in that direction. Or, again, possibly an eschatological judgment of the future. The reason why I want to bring this up is because it brings new light to parts of the New Testament that we're not paying attention to. And we're not seeing the significance of what's going on here. That's not to say that that parable has no application to us. Do we have wheat and weeds present amongst us now? Billy Graham gave us the survey and told us that 80% of those who we sit and share the pews with on Sunday are lost. There are weeds who are here at Kingsville, and they just don't know it yet. As much as there are wheat sitting right beside them on the pews Sunday after Sunday. Who's going to sort them out in the end? But that's not the only possible application of that parable. What about the great dragnet that we get when we get to the bottom of this, right? We'll get there in a second. Let's finish up parable of sower. Let's just talk briefly about the idea of good works and those who produce 30, 60, 100. If indeed the end of the age is about to happen within a generation, and he's talking about a separation that's going to occur then between the apostate Israel and the faithful remnant that will follow Jesus as Messiah, a renewed Israel that's going to bring the nations to the summit of the cosmic Mount Zion to worship the Son of Man who rules as God's anointed king, fulfilling Psalm 2 and David 7. If that's what we're looking at, then what is this concept of 30, 60, 100? He's telling his disciples this. Yours is to go and do, and your good works is going to be the thing that testifies to the true nature of this kingdom, and by virtue of that, magnetize those people who will see what you're doing. Going back to the Sermon on the Mount, letting your light shine so that people can see your good works and therefore glorify your Father in heaven. How is that going to happen? Through their preaching, through their miracle working, through the charitable giving of the church, and by virtue of all of this, people who are outside the faith, outside the kingdom, are going to want to come in. This is the very thing that God said through Isaiah would happen to this renewed Israel on the other side of their Babylonian captivity, when they were renewed through the crucible of their tortuous separation from God and their inheritance. So then we get into these other parables. But before we do, I also wanted to get here into verse 34. Because again, I really don't want to chew up the rest of our time talking about the parables. I've given you a few guidelines to chew on and think through the idea of what these parables could mean in the hearing of these disciples. Let's look at what's going on here in verse 34. Because Matthew very keenly wants to step away from the story for a second and break the fourth wall and tell us why Jesus is speaking in parables. We've already heard it from his own mouth. And from Jesus' recitation of Isaiah 6, we understand that's a judgment passage. And what Jesus is doing is a form of judgment against this, quote, divided kingdom of Israel that he is presiding over as the son of David, the rightful king that they are supposed to be following, who do not want to hear his message. He is like an Isaiah, a Solomon, who spouts wisdom directly from God, divinely inspired, and yet those who hear it are either acquiescing or walking away, right? So here Matthew wants to chime in and give us his 2 cents. Verse 34. Jesus told the crowds all these things in parables, but he did not tell them anything without a parable, so that what was spoken through the prophet might be fulfilled. The prophet who said, I will open my mouth in parables, I will declare things kept secret from the foundation of the world. All right, so for any of you with a super thick study Bible, what's the footnote there? Where is this referenced at? What part of the Old Testament does this citation come from? Anybody got anything? Psalm, there we go. Psalm, beautiful. Psalm 78. Let's all go there. This is a long one. I'm not going to read it all, but I'm just going to give you a couple of passages from it. Starting with verse 1. My people, hear my instruction. Listen to the words from my mouth. I will declare wise sayings. I will speak mysteries from the past. In summation, let me tell you from start to finish, this psalmist is going to drone on ad nauseum as he recounts Israel's history. And at certain points, he's going to tell us summarily what Israel was doing at the time when God manifested himself amongst these people. So one of those passages I would draw your eyes to would be starting in verse 9. Verse 9, the Ephraimite archers turned back on the day of battle. They did not keep God's covenant, and they refused to live by his law. They forgot what he had done, the wondrous works he had shown them. He worked wonders in the sight of their ancestors, in the land of Egypt, the territory of Zoan. He split the sea and brought them across. The waters stood firm like a wall. He led them with a cloud by day and with a fiery light throughout the night. He split the rocks in the wilderness. He gave them drink as abundant as the depths. He brought streams out of the stone and made water flow like rivers. But they continued to sin against him, rebelling in the desert against the Most High. Now, we could take that and just copy-paste it over and over again, which is exactly what he does, except he just shifts the frame of focus from this moment in history to this moment in history. And he continues to draw allusions all the way back to the Old Testament Exodus, when God, out of his generous mercy, delivered them out of Egypt, sustained them in the wilderness, gave them a land that he alone promised they did nothing to earn on their own merit. And when they get there, they're going to live in houses they didn't build, drink out of cisterns they didn't dig, pick fruit off of trees that they did not plant, and from vineyards they didn't plant. And all of this because God is faithful. God is good. Another passage I would draw to mind here from this very same psalm, verse 40. How often they rebelled against him in the wilderness. I mean, just think about it, right? Here they are. Every day you wake up and you walk outside your tent, and everywhere you can see, there is this flaky sweet stuff at your feet, and you can get as much as you want. And it was like that for the last 233 days. And it's going to be like this until you finally cross through that river, whenever that is. And when everybody gets thirsty, what does God do? There's not a drop of water around, and there's not a drop of rain coming from the sky, and God cracks open rocks. And he gives everybody enough, so much that it looks like rivers and ponds out in the desert. And yet still, this is what the psalmist has to say about his people in their apostate past. They grieved him in the wilderness. They constantly tested God. They provoked the Holy One of Israel. They did not remember his power shown on the day he redeemed them from the foe. He performed his miraculous signs in Egypt, and again, his wonders in the territory of Zoan. Then he goes on to talk about all the plagues. Then I want you to skip down to verse 59, and we're going to read the rest of the psalm. God heard and became furious. He completely rejected Israel. He abandoned the tabernacle at Shiloh, and this is kind of midway through their history. Remember, this actually happens in the book of Samuel, when the Philistines break through the lines of Saul and they make it back after they capture the Ark of the Covenant. And Jeremiah will tell us sometime later, they destroyed the tabernacle, burnt the whole thing to the ground. Verse 61, he gave up his strength to captivity. Israel is his strength. He forks them over to captivity, and his splendor where he manifests his glory through this people, to the hand of a foe. He surrendered his people to the sword because he was enraged with his heritage. Fire consumed his chosen young men, and his young women had no wedding songs. His priests fell by the sword, and the widows could not lament. Any of this could be seen in any of these moments, the tragedies of the Assyrian deportation, captivity, and the same thing with Babylon. The Lord awoke. Here we are, verse 65. It all starts to change. The Lord awoke as if from sleep, like a warrior from the effects of wine. He beat back his foes. He gave them lasting disgrace. That sounds like he's taking his vengeance out on his enemies, right? Well, verse 67. He rejected the tent of Joseph and did not choose the tribe of Ephraim. He chose instead the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion, which he loved. He built his sanctuary like the heights, like the earth that he established forever. He chose David his servant and took him from the sheep pens. He brought him from tending ewes to be shepherd over his people Jacob, over Israel, his inheritance. He shepherded them with a pure heart and guided them with his skillful hands. Great, awesome history lesson. What does this have to do with anything? Well, number one, you may have heard me say in this forum before. If not, let me just say it now. It's bad hermeneutics for us to just look at any quotation that comes from a New Testament author or speaker and assume that only those verses are active. One of the best proof texts of that is usually Luke chapter 4, when Jesus is preaching in his hometown synagogue, reading from the Isaiah scroll. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, and he has anointed me to preach, but most often you will hear people say, not proclaim the day of the Lord's vengeance and the year of his acceptance. Problem with that is when you use that philosophy, what do you make of Jesus crying out from the cross when he is nailed to it and he looks up to heaven and he begins by quoting the first verse of Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Well, because the Father looked away from the Son, who has now become totally overcome with sin. That's true, theologically speaking. But what else is embedded in that psalm that's literally happening right in front of them? When you read the words of David in Psalm 22, what is David talking about? His mouth is so dry it feels like swallowing sand. Was Jesus dehydrated through bleeding on the cross? Do you think every swallow that he took was just excruciatingly painful? What about David saying the fact that they are casting lots, throwing dice over the rags he wore? What were the soldiers doing at the foot of the cross? What do we make of David's statement? They have pierced my hands. Every joint is out of its socket. Did that happen to Jesus on the cross? Absolutely. And these people who hear Psalm 22 and grew up reciting it from memory are watching this spectacle happen in front of them. He doesn't have to sing the rest of the song. And you can't say that's a unique case because that standard can't be the one standard we use here and fail to use it in other places. The point I make is as Matthew tells us, Jesus is speaking in parables because of the fact we are supposed to understand very clearly that he is speaking things, wisdom from Israel's ancient past. We have to then, if we're not familiar with it already, go back to that psalm and read the whole context, just like we would Psalm 22, to discover those secrets and why Jesus cited that. When we read through all these verses of Psalm 78, we get a wonderful history lesson of how from the moment Israel comes out of Egypt, they continue to mess up. God is faithful and they spit in his face. So how does God end this when he awakes as if from sleep, valiantly triumphs like a warrior, vanquishing his enemies? But who are his enemies? Israel. But he's calling out from them a remnant. And in that process, he is going to build a sanctuary. Another word for sanctuary might be what? Temple. Temple. He is going to build his temple on his mountain where he is going to bring his remnant. This shouldn't be shocking. John chapter 2. Actually, let's go back to John chapter 1. This is fun. John chapter 1, verse 14. The Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. What is that word dwelt in Greek, actually? Come on, there's got to be a Bible nerd out there that knows it. Tabernacled. He came to manifest his glory amongst us as a temple. John chapter 2, he's there, kicking over tables, smashing animal crates, throwing money everywhere. And as the dust is all settling and they're looking at this guy like he's crazy, who gave you authority to do this? what does Jesus answer these naysayers with? Destroy this what? Temple, and I'll raise it again in 3 days. Are you mad? This took 46 years to build. But John says, you need to know he was talking about the temple of his body. Oh, by the way, who is Jesus descended from? David. David comes from what tribe? Judah. In other words, at the end of Psalm 78, notice I said at the end of Psalm 78, there seems to be a harvest here where he is pulling a remnant out through his chosen king David, descended from Judah, and building a temple on his mountain for them. What is this parable, these series of parables telling us about? There's going to come a harvest at the end of the age. And there's going to be wheat and weeds. And there's going to be a separation between the two. And it all starts with that parable of the sower. And then just gets eked out into all the rest of these parables. Such that if we just take a brief moment and look at parable of the mustard seed. Verse 31. Kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. Smallest of all the seeds, but when it's grown, it's taller than all the garden plants and becomes a tree. Oh, but Jesus, it doesn't become a tree. I mean, a mustard shrub is pretty tall. It can grow up to 10 feet. But that ain't no tree. Not when you're looking around Israel and you see places like Lebanon that has these stately cedar trees, right, that people build palaces out of. How can you call a mustard bush a tree? That depends on with which eyes you're looking at, right? Or with. If you don't see the kingdom, then all you see is just an unstately bush. If you see the kingdom through spiritual eyes, this is a majestic tree that birds from all over get to come and lodge in. It depends on your perspective. What are people making of the Jesus movement? Did we not just read that? From chapters 8 through the end of 11, it's all about these wonderful miracles. Jesus performs 10 of them. And in between it all, we have Matthew giving us a synopsis of how the people are treating what Jesus is doing. Some are like, he's Messiah. I bet the farm on it. Some are like, yeah, I'm kind of seeing it, but I'm not really sure yet. I definitely wouldn't bet the farm. And then some are like, you people are going to go to Sheol and spend eternity with the great prince of demons, Satan, because you think that false teacher is Messiah. How can there be such widespread reaction? Some see a stately tree, and some see an unsightly shrub. Or what about the parable of the leaven, right? Woman hides a lump of leaven inside a batch of dough. She kneads it together and then lets it have its time to rise until it's completely permeated the whole loaf, and then bakes it, and we get the final product. Either way, when it comes to a seed germinating to become the big, tall, stately tree or unsightly shrub, and the bread that has to take time to rise and the yeast do its work, it's a process, What's God been doing for the last 5 centuries while Israel's been in captivity? You might think, well, there is no work of God. If there was, then we would have books that reflect that's in the Scriptures. That could be a good point. But you can't say that God isn't working to keep a people faithful. How familiar are you with the story of the Maccabees or Antiochus Epiphanes? The one who is really the story behind the reference of the abomination of desolation in Matthew 24. This was an evil, Seleucid, quote, Greek king, who decided because he couldn't have his way with the southern kingdom in Egypt, he was going to take out his ferocious fury on this little town of Jerusalem. And what he does is essentially outlaws the Jewish faith. If anybody is found having any manuscripts in their home, they are immediately executed. After he profanes the temple by sacrificing a pig on their altar and erecting a statue of himself in the holy place, most holy place, he forbids Jewish mothers and fathers from circumcising their boys 8 days after they're born. And if they do, they die. You might be surprised to know who the actual champions of the faith were at this moment. The Pharisees. The reason why Pharisees are so respected nearly a century and a half later in the time of Jesus is because they were the ones who took their stand and said, you can kill us if you want. We're not going to stop worshiping the Lord. It's that simple. Now, granted, those Pharisees in Jesus' day are a far cry from their ancestors, but that was a faithful movement. That was a faithful movement that was waiting expectantly upon Messiah. You have to know, right? If you're a Jew living in Jerusalem at the time when this wicked king comes to town and makes your way of life completely outlawed under pain of death. Do you think these people were waiting and praying fervently for Messiah to come now to rescue them? Do you think that they were waiting to be separated out from these people to receive the majesty of the kingdom promised? You better believe they were. Did it come? No. But it would later. So there were seeds sprouting up all over the place of people waiting expectantly. And we know that germination leads to a great harvest because these are the people who come in Acts 2 to Pentecost and hear Peter preach, and the Spirit can cut them at heart because they were waiting. And now that they've heard, they respond in faith. Or, what about the parable of the hidden treasure and the priceless pearl? Kingdom of heaven is like treasure buried in the field that a man found, reburied. Then in his great joy he goes and sells everything he has and he buys that field. Or the merchant, fine pearls from the sea. We've got a treasure buried in the ground, and we've got a pearl that comes from the sea. Would you be surprised if I told you that as far as biblical symbology goes, oftentimes land is a reference to Israel and the sea is a reference to the Gentile nations? Isaiah 17 would be a great reference point for this, because as Isaiah talks about how the nations roil like uncontrolled and untamed waves in the ocean, yet God stands to silence them all, and He will deal with the foes of His people by silencing these waves. So if that's the case, what is the kingdom made of? Bless you. What is the kingdom made of? First, it's made up of Jews from Israel, the land, right? Because it's all about the land. But who comes in after the Jews? The Gentiles from the sea. They're brought in. And it's the finest possession that anyone should be willing to give their entire livelihood in order to possess and not keep a secret, but so that everybody might be able to enjoy it. And it's not surprising that at the end of this chapter we'll see Jesus talking about Himself being rejected, right? If we're thinking about David and the Psalms and the character that we get of David in the Psalms, it's so different from the David of Samuel or even Chronicles, right? The David of Samuel and Chronicles seems like a warrior king that nobody would dare challenge. He stands mighty and victorious as a roaring lion of Judah that inspires men from other nations to come and join his ranks, even if they don't share his bloodline. And they will gladly give their lives for a king that wasn't the king ruling over them when they were born. But when you read the David of Psalms, you see a man who sometimes feels so lonely, so dejected, so rejected by others, that he's on an emotional roller coaster. Why is that? Well, we shouldn't be surprised then if David felt rejection. And here we are in the progress of Matthew's gospel, and Jesus is being painted as a new David and a new Solomon, that he too would experience rejection just like these men did. That he would have conspirators at his back waiting to betray him. That he would have his naysayers filling his ranks, pretending to be disciples, and in reality they're false. And others who are willing to die for him. So I hope, while this may have been a lot, I hope that I didn't just steamroll over all of y'all and left you in the dirt behind me. I realize now as I'm saying that it's been a little while since I've asked if there have been any questions. Let me take a moment here to just shut my trap and then give you guys an opportunity to speak or ask any questions that you might have to try to close this up and make sure we clarify anything that needs clarifying. And if you want me to, somebody can just point and I will go turn the camera off and nobody has to hear our chat if that's what you want. I'm totally fine with that. You know, since I said that, I'm just going to go do that.